Now, let's welcome Mr. Gabor Holch to give his speech. Now,
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Jeanette, for a fantastic introduction. I will try to live up to the expectations that you created. And also, it's very nice to see so many of you. I mean, as Jeanette mentioned in her introduction, I have been in China since 2002, always keeping my base here. Most recently in Shanghai, I started company management consulting in 2005. We specialize in what we call intercultural leadership skills. So basically, we mostly help multinational companies to lead across cultural boundaries, mostly between the European and the Asia-Pacific region. So the way you have to imagine it is that we usually work with the high-level leadership of, let's say, a European company with branches in the Asia-Pacific. And increasingly, we also work with Asia-Pacific leaders who are promoted to global or international leadership positions from multinational companies, whether European, local Asian, or let's say I work with American, let's say Brazilian, Japanese, Korean, and lots of other companies. So I would be actually one of the great examples for the disruption of the last 2 years on people working together, because under normal circumstances, I would be in China about half of the time and I would be everywhere else in the world for the other half, working with the worldwide branches of the same companies. Also, many of the leaders that I work with, they are equally good examples of how the last 2 years interrupted the way we imagined work and the way we connected with each other, and how these 2 years basically forced us to be creative when it comes to collaboration. So I would like to bring you a couple of thoughts. I would like to bring you a couple of examples of what has changed, why it has changed, and also I would like to show you a couple of markers into future directions. Obviously, one of the important things that we know about the future is that we don't know about the future too much. So nobody can say where we are going, but I think we have a pretty good idea of what is it that we have to adopt quickly so that we can keep working with each other. Why I call it virtual humanity? Because one thing that we found out during the past 2 years is that technology is going to make it easier to connect, but it's not going to substitute connection. So, you know, there are different levels of digitalizing in human relations. The first one is what we are doing now, basically. So if we have a telephone set, or if we have an MS Teams or a Zoom meeting or something similar, it's still human beings connecting with each other. So we are still working in a team, except we use different communication methods and different channels. And that's already important, because probably many of you remember from your university studies or from a communication training that a significant portion of what we communicate is actually not the words we say, the words we utter, but a lot of non-verbal and other communication channels, including the tone of our voice, including our body language, even including some mysterious connections that we don't understand that much. So just physical closeness, the community of people in a room, and so on. So I have been working with leadership teams for an extremely long time. I have been trying to avoid the classical mistake of trying to do exactly the same online as we do at a physical meeting or a physical training or a physical coaching session. So that has been proven many, many times, that if we just bring the communication to another medium but otherwise communicate exactly the same way as we did before, that is simply not going to work. But it also doesn't mean, as many people that you talk to will say, that virtual meetings, virtual leadership, virtual training, virtual coaching simply doesn't work. It means that when we use a different medium, we have to rethink the way we communicate with each other. We have to think about what is missing. We have to think about what opportunities might be there in the new medium that are not there in the traditional medium. we have to look at how human diversity influences the communication in the new medium. So for example, how do different people with different character, different personality respond differently to a digital medium of collaboration or communication? And then finally, we have to draw the lessons and we have to apply the lessons in everyday work. And this is what I am trying to give you in this short presentation today. So there are a couple of things that since most of you are in the field of HR, I probably don't have to remind you about this, but just let's look at a couple of things. Assuming that there is a company that has teamwork, has meetings, has a certain organizational structure, and suddenly either due to COVID or for any other reason, for example, the company has grown and started opening branches in different geographic locations, they have to start working online. Now, there are a couple of very basic legal and managerial issues that you probably know. So, for example, many of your companies have a so-called employee handbook that defines certain things like how long the working day is, which is much more difficult to define when somebody is working from home or working from the cafe downstairs. So when the employee handbook says that people start work at 9 and stop working at, let's say, 6 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, how do you check that? How do you measure that? Also, performance management issues, because it is much more difficult to connect with people in a remote location. Sometimes it is difficult to check whether they have delivered at all. So anything physical that you have to deliver is much more difficult to check in a virtual environment. But also lots of others, let's say annual leaves, maternity leaves, sick leaves, who is part of the team and who is not, information safety, intellectual property, and lots of other issues. I don't want to reiterate all of these, but we can come back to them if you want. But there are some other issues as well. So imagine that there is a sales team, or there is a team of visual designers, or computer programmers, or research and development people. And suddenly you bring them online. Now, some people are going to be very happy about this. So imagine somebody who is, let's say, relatively affluent, single, or his or her kids have already grown up. Let's say the spouse goes to work in the morning, or the spouse works flexibly. And then working from home can be a lovely idea with a cup of coffee in hand. But now imagine other people who either don't have a spacious home or have a spacious home but with 3 kids and the spouse who's also working from home. Or imagine that somebody is working in a climate where people don't have sealed windows and doors in their homes and there is a lot of street noise. So suddenly you can create advantages and disadvantages in the virtual space that you haven't thought of before. So relatively speaking, the easiest situation is for single people, affluent people, predominantly men, because they are more in the life situation where they are not disturbed, and people in a, how do you say, in a not so affluent financial situation, women, especially mothers and especially single mothers, and certain cultural spheres, they are going to be disadvantaged. It is also a proven fact through research that certain gaps have actually widened. The gender gap that I mentioned to you right now it has shown that these 2 years recently have been a long enough time that we started some consistent trends, and we can already see, for example, that women, and especially women who are mothers or even single mothers, they started falling behind in the promotion scaling companies that went virtual, simply for the disadvantages that they suffered. We can also see in certain countries the same tendency towards ethnic groups or income groups who have smaller homes and environments which are more difficult to isolate. And there are lots of others as well, but we can again come back to this a little bit later. I would like to go a little bit deeper, and I would like to look at not just how objective factors such as income, the size of your home, gender, and so on influences online work, but also the cultural factor, which can be just as important. I will use the DISC system, but you could use any other. You could use the Big Five, or you could use MBTI. And I think most of the people in our HR working group have basic training in these methodologies. So at the beginning in 2020, when a lot of companies were forced to go online, many people asked me who respond better to this transition. For example, introverts or extroverts. And at that time, I was in Europe most of the time. I spent the bigger half of 2020 in Europe. And then in the autumn of 2020, I came back to China. And ever since I have been here. While I was in Europe, I was in closer touch with my sister, who is a psychologist. And we had very long Zoom chats about this. And we found out that actually, if we look at this personality feature, both introverts and extroverts have certain challenges and have certain advantages, although at the beginning it looked like introverts responded to the change much better. So it looked like extroverts really started missing the lack of human contact, the closeness, and the loneliness. Whereas introverts, they sometimes even felt grateful for the isolation, that they didn't have to go to work every day. They didn't have to say hello to everybody. They didn't have to go out for lunch together with a larger group. However, in the long run, the negative aspect of the isolation, which is sometimes a simple feeling of loneliness, which is the #1 challenge that many research agencies found in remote work, but it can even go towards depression and sometimes even clinical conditions, and influenced introverts much more than extroverts, because extroverts have this kind of internal desire to reach out to people, and eventually they, through virtual parties, they created task forces, they regularly called their contacts, and they preferred video chats as opposed to, let's say, phone calls or just sending emails. So at the end of the day, we found out there is no real advantage. We are all human beings. We suffer in different ways. We can counterbalance the suffering in different ways, but specifically employers have to be very careful about how different temperaments are going to cause problems and generate solutions. What is true about individuals is also true about communities. So if you look at the chart on the left side, you have extroverted people, you have extroverted communities. You have introverted people and communities. You have task-focused communities whose danger in the virtual workspace was usually that they never stop working. So normal life, three-dimensional life, has a kind of rhythm, a kind of routine, which says you are working when you're in the office and you're not working when you're not in the office, including during your lunch break and during your coffee break and during, let's say, 2 days when you are doing training or when you take a leave. But people who were working from home for months, they found themselves working all the time. And especially if people work across a couple of time zones, what's going to happen that the information flow literally never stops. So people who had a stronger task orientation, they found themselves working all the time, and especially in the DISC system, the C style, which is both task orientated and responsive, simply couldn't create the mental barriers to say, listen, at that time I will stop working, walk away from my screen, and I will just relax. The younger people are, the more likely it is that the electronic gadget that they use to work is exactly the same apparatus that they use for entertainment. And then it becomes extremely difficult to walk away from work because it's the same laptop. And if I'm watching my evening television show or YouTube video, my emails will still keep popping up and create this never-ending flow. We can look at the other side as well, people-focused cultures, if you're interested. But I would like to jump into another topic, which is professional communities. Different functions in organization, they have different styles exactly the same way as you have different national cultures. Now, if you physically put people into a physical space like an office building, when these different styles collaborate with each other, they have to meet each other. And this is one of the most important way of getting information for collaboration. You probably know that there are even architectural styles. So, for example, technology companies in Silicon Valleys, they design their headquarters so that they deliberately mix together different functions. They have to meet each other in the cafeteria, they have to meet each other in the lobby, along the corridors, and so on. One thing that digital transition did is it separated functional teams with different work cultures. So introverts, let's say the legal department, the finance department, the engineering department, their virtual meetings were just too long and too boring for people from, let's say, public relations or sales. And the sales and the public relations meetings, they just seemed too pointless and too loud for people from introverted professions, such as, let's say, architects or accountants. And then again, we managed to widen the gap a little bit. Now, what is it that we can do? What we can do is basically two different things. One of them is short term and the other one is long term. The short term is that we have to make sure to create digital spaces at work which are to some extent acceptable to all different styles. So, because a healthy team is diverse, it has a diversity of styles, it has a balance of different team roles. So one of them, the McKinsey chart on the left side, please don't worry about it too much because there's an awful lot in there. What is very important is that in order to roll well with this digital transition, we need different kind of styles. So look at cognitive, interpersonal, self-leadership, and digital. And you probably know that the people with different talents, different work styles, they have their advantages and disadvantages in each of these fields. So obviously self-leadership, people with a relatively high level of energy, with a proactive, extroverted nature, they are going to be better self-managers than, let's say, introverts. If you look at interpersonal skills, then again, obviously, sociable people, the right side of the disk chart, is going to have an advantage over the task-focused styles, which was the left side of the charts here. What you can see on the right side is the score in the OC Tenor work culture report. I would be happy to send you each of these reports. Different cultures responded to this crisis in different ways. And when they responded, they also responded with a different level of success. So if you look at the requirement, for example, to work from home, you can see a couple of differences. One of the big questions, if it is maintainable at all to send people online. So for example, now we are switching to the little bit localized mindset because we are the European Chamber in China. So in China, it was much more realistic than in India. In Sweden, it was much more realistic than in China. In urban China, it's much more realistic than in rural China. Within urban China, it's much more realistic within the affluent population than among the deprived population, and so on. So it is comparative, but it is not just a question of how much money you have, whether you have a good broadband connection. For example, in the countryside in China, you probably heard these stories like school teacher climbs tree in order to be able to deliver online lecture, something like this. It is not just that, but it's also the willingness. So for some reason that researchers are still going to work on for a couple of months or years, it was much easier to send Europeans home than Asians. And then within it, Japan was one of the most difficult populations to keep at home. Again, researchers are thinking they have good broadband connections, they are relatively affluent society, they usually have, if not as large homes as in Europe, but enough so that you can find a corner to work in. But for some reason, families are not used to staying together for the entire day. And especially the breadwinner is being judged a little bit if they stay home all day. So there are lots of these cultural factors. Also, we have to look at countries in a context of comparing to each other, because we are talking about multinational companies. And what is happening now is that companies are looking at the feasibility of these digitalization plans, and they are going to move operations, not necessarily, let's say, manufacturing operations, but definitely intangible operations like legal centers, customer service centers, research and development operations, sales centers, and lots of others, depending on where is the easiest to run these kind of operations. So, to summarize quickly, they are going to move their digital workforce to places with a great internet connection, with a favorable immigration policy, with the right services surrounding the business, the technological readiness of the population. So, for example, does that country have digital currencies? Does it have payment apps? Does it have a good mobile phone system, and so on? But also it's going to be important that there are certain cultural factors, and companies are going to choose just as much based on those cultural factors. So, for example, can families live their lives properly if, let's say, both parents work from home? What is going to happen to children? What kind of education system that society has? And lots of others. I think I will stop here. I will use the remaining time to circle back to any of the slides. I will show you my contact slide, and if I have to, for the questions that have come in, then I will move back to any of the slides. It's very easy to find me online in case you don't get answers to your questions or you cannot make the remarks that you want to make during the event today. So, Ralph is asking, thanks for the interesting presentation. Question to Gabor and Jeanette. Chinese government legislations about an upcoming modernization of the Chinese labor and social insurance